The champagne glasses clinked around me, but I might as well have been invisible. 200 guests filled the Heritage Country Club's grand ballroom, all gathered to celebrate my sister Natalie's engagement to Lucas Brennan. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light over designer dresses and tailored suits, while servers glided between clusters of Pine Ridge's most prominent families. Everyone who mattered in our small Colorado mountain town was there, laughing, congratulating, taking photos. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everyone except me. Oh, I was physically present. I stood near the back wall in my dress uniform, the gold stripes on my sleeves catching the light, my Admiral's insignia polished to perfection. But according to the evening's program, according to the elaborate slideshow playing on 3 large screens, according to every speech and toast given so far, Cassandra Harper simply didn't exist. The slideshows cycled through decades of family photos. Natalie as a baby, held by our beaming parents. Natalie's first steps, with mom and dad cheering in the background. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies, family vacations. 28 years of memories, and in every single image that should have included both Harper daughters, I had been carefully cropped out. Edited away. Erased. I watched my mother, Diane Harper, glide across the room in her emerald silk dress, accepting congratulations like a queen holding court. She had planned this party for months, obsessing over every detail from the hand-calligraphed invitations to the imported orchid centerpieces. Nothing had been left to chance, including my systematic removal from our family's visual history. My father, Richard Harper, stood beside the bar holding court with his business associates, his chest puffed with pride as he spoke about his precious daughter and her brilliant catch of a fiancé. In his version of events, he had one daughter. Just one. I had known what to expect. The invitation that arrived at my base in San Diego 3 weeks ago had been addressed simply to Cassandra Harper, with no mention of my rank, my 25 years of naval service, or the fact that I had just been promoted to Rear Admiral, the youngest woman in Navy history to achieve that distinction. The invitation looked like an afterthought, the kind you send to distant relatives you feel obligated to include, but hope won't actually attend. But I had attended. I flew across the country, arranged leave, and stood here in my dress whites because somewhere in the depths of my heart, I still harbored the foolish hope that this might be different. That maybe, just maybe, my sister's engagement party would be the moment our fractured family found its way back to something resembling love. Instead, I found myself watching my own erasure in real time. Natalie moved through the crowd like sunshine, her blonde hair styled in an elegant updo, her custom gown flowing behind her as she accepted endless congratulations. She looked radiant, genuinely happy, and for a moment I felt a stab of something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't forgiveness either. She had to know I was here. She had to see me standing alone against the wall. Yet she hadn't acknowledged me once in the 3 hours since the party began. I remembered when we were children, before the distance grew too wide to bridge. Natalie, 4 years younger, had followed me everywhere. I taught her to ride a bike, to braid her hair, to throw a perfect spiral with a football. When she had nightmares, she would slip into my bed, whispering about monsters under her bed while I told her stories about brave princesses who saved themselves. But that was before I chose the Navy over college, duty over comfort, service over staying home. That was before my parents made it clear that having a daughter in the military was somehow shameful, somehow less than having a daughter who married well and produced grandchildren on schedule. The slideshow shifted to more recent photos. Natalie's college graduation, our parents beaming beside her. Natalie's promotion at the marketing firm, celebrated with dinner at Pine Ridge's fanciest restaurant. Natalie meeting Lucas at a charity gala, their whirlwind romance documented in perfectly posed photographs. What the slideshow didn't show was me receiving my commission as an ensign 25 years ago, while my family stayed home claiming they couldn't get time off work. It didn't show my first deployment, when I sent photos from the Persian Gulf that were never displayed on any family mantle. It didn't show my promotion to captain, when I called home excited to share the news and heard my mother's flat, disinterested response. "That's nice, dear." Natalie made partner at her firm last month. It certainly didn't show 3 weeks ago, when I stood in the Pentagon receiving my Admiral's star from the Secretary of the Navy himself. While news cameras captured the historic moment and my phone remained silent, not a single congratulatory text from anyone who shared my DNA. The irony wasn't lost on me that I commanded respect from admirals and generals, that my strategic decisions affected thousands of sailors, that my name appeared in briefings that reached the highest levels of government, yet in this ballroom filled with small-town socialites, I was nobody. Less than nobody. I was the family embarrassment they preferred to pretend had never existed. I sipped my club soda and lime, having learned long ago that staying sharp and alert was more valuable than dulling the edges with alcohol. Around me, conversations flowed about vacation homes and country club memberships, about whose children had gotten into which prestigious colleges, about the latest drama in Pine Ridge's social hierarchy. It was a world I had never quite belonged to, even as a child. Growing up, I had been the one who preferred books to parties, who asked too many questions in Sunday school, who dreamed of adventures beyond the mountain peaks that surrounded our town. While Natalie played with dolls and practiced ballet, I collected maps and read biographies of explorers. While she learned to host tea parties, I taught myself to navigate by the stars. Our parents had tolerated my quirks when I was young, calling me their little tomboy with indulgent smiles. But as I grew older, and my interests didn't shift toward more traditionally feminine pursuits, the indulgence turned to concern, then to barely concealed disappointment. I was 15 when I first mentioned wanting to attend the Naval Academy. We were sitting around the dinner table, and I had just finished a report on Admiral Grace Hopper for my computer science class. I was excited about what I had learned, about the possibility of combining my love of technology with my desire to serve something larger than myself. "The Naval Academy doesn't accept girls like you," my mother had said, her voice carrying that particular tone of disdain she reserved for my more ambitious dreams. "You need to be realistic about your options." My father had nodded in agreement. "The military is no place for a Harper daughter. We have a reputation to maintain in this community." But there had been one person who understood. Frank Davidson, my grandfather's oldest friend and practically a member of our family, had served in the Navy during Vietnam. He had quietly encouraged my interests, sharing stories of his service, helping me understand the application process, even driving me to recruitment meetings when my parents refused. Frank had been the one to teach me that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. He had been the one to tell me that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who understand you least, and that finding your own path might mean walking away from theirs. He had died of a heart attack during my second year at the academy, and I had been granted emergency leave to attend his funeral. I remembered standing in my crisp midshipman uniform at his graveside, feeling utterly alone as my family treated me like a stranger wearing a costume. Even in grief, they couldn't see past their disappointment in my choices. Now, watching my sister's engagement party unfold without me, I wondered what Frank would have said about this moment. Probably something wise about family being the people who choose to love you, not just the people who share your blood. The evening's program continued with speeches from Lucas's family, warm and generous people who spoke about welcoming Natalie into their hearts. Lucas's father, a retired judge, gave a particularly moving toast about the importance of family bonds and supporting each other through all of life's challenges. The irony burned like acid in my throat. I found myself studying Lucas Brennan as he stood beside my sister, his arm around her waist, his face glowing with genuine happiness. He was handsome in an understated way, with dark hair slightly graying at the temples, and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Everything I had heard about him suggested he was a good man, a successful architect, active in community service, devoted to his aging parents. What struck me most was how he looked at Natalie. There was real love there, real partnership. He didn't just see her as a beautiful accessory or a social advantage. He saw her as a complete person worthy of respect and admiration. It made me both happy for my sister and profoundly sad for what we had lost between us. The master of ceremonies, a family friend who had known us since childhood, took the microphone for what was clearly meant to be the evening's emotional climax. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special surprise tonight." Natalie's parents, Richard and Diane Harper, have prepared a video message that traces their daughter's journey from a beloved little girl to the wonderful woman we celebrate tonight. The lights dimmed, and a new video began playing on the screens. This one was more elaborate than the slideshow, with professional editing and a soundtrack that tugged at the heartstrings. It opened with footage of Natalie as a toddler, taking her first wobbly steps into our mother's arms. The narrator, my father's voice, recorded specially for the occasion, spoke about the joy of watching their only daughter grow into such an accomplished young woman. Only daughter. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had spent my entire adult life serving my country, rising through the ranks in a male-dominated field, earning respect and recognition at the highest levels of military leadership. I had commanded ships, managed billion-dollar budgets, made decisions that affected national security. I had sacrificed personal relationships, comfortable living situations, and easy career paths in service to something greater than myself. And to my family, I was nothing. Not just ignored or minimized, but completely erased.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The video continued, showing Natalie's high school cheerleading, her sorority days, her graduation from business school, her early career successes. Every milestone was lovingly documented, every achievement celebrated. Our parents glowed with pride as they narrated their daughter's accomplishments, their voices warm with unconditional love and support. I thought about my own milestones. My graduation from the Naval Academy, where I finished in the top 10% of my class. My first command assignment, where I led a crew of 300 sailors through a complex humanitarian mission. My promotion to captain, achieved ahead of schedule because of my performance evaluations. My recent advancement to Admiral, making me one of the most senior women in Navy history. None of it had merited so much as a congratulatory phone call from the people who raised me. As the video reached its conclusion, showing recent photos of Natalie and Lucas together, my father's voice grew even warmer. We are so proud of the woman Natalie has become, and so grateful that Lucas has chosen to join our family. Tonight, we celebrate not just their engagement, but the beautiful future they will build together. The applause was thunderous. People dabbed at their eyes with napkins, moved by the obvious love between parents and daughter. Natalie herself was crying happy tears as Lucas pulled her close, and even I had to admit it was a beautiful moment. It was also a moment that made my absence from their lives devastatingly clear. I stood against the wall in my dress uniform, surrounded by 200 people who were celebrating my family, and I had never felt more alone. The gold stripes on my sleeves that represented years of dedication and sacrifice meant nothing here. The Admiral's star that had taken me decades to earn was invisible to the people who had once claimed to love me. But something inside me had shifted during that video. Something that had been bent for years finally snapped, not with anger but with clarity. I was done waiting for their approval. I was done hoping they would see me as worthy of their love. I was done pretending that their rejection didn't cut me to the bone every single day. I had spent 25 years proving myself to everyone except the people whose opinion I had wanted most. I had let their disappointment shape my expectations for so long that I had forgotten what I deserved. I deserved better than this. As the applause died down and conversations resumed, I made a decision. I wouldn't leave quietly. I wouldn't slip out the back door and pretend this evening hadn't happened. I wouldn't let them erase me without consequence. But I also wouldn't make a scene. I was a naval officer, trained in strategy and timing. Whatever I did, it would be precise, dignified, and utterly devastating. I just had to wait for the right moment. That moment came sooner than I expected. As the evening moved toward its conclusion, Lucas took the microphone for what was clearly meant to be his final speech of the night. He thanked everyone for coming, spoke movingly about his love for Natalie, and expressed his gratitude to the Harper family for welcoming him so warmly. Then he said something that changed everything. Before we close tonight's celebration, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone whose presence makes this evening even more special. His eyes scanned the crowd, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought he was looking directly at me. We are honored to have so many distinguished guests with us tonight, including members of our armed services who have dedicated their lives to protecting our freedom. The crowd murmured appreciatively, and I felt my pulse quicken. Surely he wasn't going to. In particular, Lucas continued, his voice growing stronger, I want to recognize a true American hero who happens to be part of the Harper family. My mother's face went pale. My father looked confused, then alarmed. Natalie's eyes went wide as she realized what was happening. Lucas smiled directly at me, and his next words rang out clear and strong across the suddenly silent ballroom. Admiral Cassandra Harper, would you please join us up here? The silence was deafening. 200 faces turned toward me, some confused, others shocked, a few beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just been revealed. My parents looked like they had been struck by lightning. I stood perfectly still for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then, with the bearing that had been drilled into me through decades of military service, I began walking toward the front of the room. Every step echoed in the silence. My dress uniform was immaculate, my posture perfect, my expression calm and dignified. I was no longer the invisible daughter standing against the wall. I was Admiral Cassandra Harper, one of the most senior officers in the United States Navy, and it was time for Pine Ridge to meet her. The walk to the front of the Heritage Country Club's ballroom felt like crossing a minefield. Every eye in the room tracked my movement, whispers rippling through the crowd like waves. I could feel the weight of their stares, the confusion, the sudden realization that they had been in the presence of someone significant without knowing it. My mother's face had drained of all color, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the shock and horror in her eyes. My father stood frozen beside her, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, looking like a man who had just watched his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Natalie's expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear. But Lucas Brennan stood waiting for me with a genuine smile, extending his hand as I approached the small stage where the evening speakers had addressed the crowd. His eyes held respect and warmth, and for the first time all evening, I felt truly seen by someone in this room. Admiral Harper, he said as I reached him, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Thank you for being here tonight. Your presence honors us all. The formal handshake he offered was firm and respectful, the kind exchanged between equals. But what happened next caught everyone, including me, completely off guard. Instead of simply shaking my hand, Lucas came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute. The gesture was perfect, practiced, unmistakably genuine. His posture was ramrod straight, his salute precise, and held for exactly the right duration. This wasn't some civilian's approximation of military courtesy. This was the real thing. Admiral, he said formally, on behalf of all Americans, thank you for your service to our nation. The ballroom erupted. Not in applause, that would come later, but in a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and sudden conversations as people began to understand what they had just witnessed. I returned Lucas's salute with equal precision, my own training taking over as muscle memory guided my movements. Thank you, Mr. Brennan, I replied, my voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. And thank you for recognizing not just me, but all those who serve. As we completed the formal exchange, Lucas leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping just below the microphone's range. Marine Corps, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I know what that uniform means, Admiral. I know what you've sacrificed to wear it. The pieces clicked into place. His perfect salute, his genuine respect, his apparent understanding of military protocol, Lucas Brennan was a veteran. And unlike my family, he understood exactly what my rank in service meant. He turned back to the microphone, his arm gesturing to include me in his address to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand what an extraordinary honor it is to have Admiral Harper with us tonight. She is the youngest woman in United States Navy history to achieve the rank of Rear Admiral. She has commanded naval vessels, overseen complex international operations, and dedicated her entire adult life to protecting the freedoms we all enjoy. The applause began then, tentative at first, then growing stronger as the full weight of Lucas's words sank in. But I noticed who wasn't clapping. My parents stood motionless, their faces pale with what looked like panic. Natalie clapped mechanically, her eyes darting between me and our parents as if trying to calculate some impossible equation. Lucas wasn't finished. Admiral Harper has received numerous commendations for her service, including the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star. She has represented our nation with distinction in some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable, always with honor, always with courage. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being truly acknowledged for my achievements. When was the last time someone had listed my accomplishments with pride rather than treating them as embarrassments to be hidden away? But perhaps most remarkably, Lucas continued, his voice growing warmer, she has done all of this while maintaining the grace, dignity, and strength that clearly runs in the Harper family. Natalie, your sister is a genuine American hero. The crowd was fully engaged now, their applause enthusiastic and sustained. I saw several people wiping away tears, moved by Lucas's words and perhaps by their own realization of how they had overlooked someone so accomplished. A few of the older gentlemen in the crowd, veterans themselves judging by their bearing, stood and saluted. But the Harper family table remained a pocket of stunned silence in the midst of the celebration. Lucas handed me the microphone, and suddenly I found myself facing 200 expectant faces. The same people who had ignored me all evening now hung on every word, waiting to hear from the woman they had just learned was one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Navy. I took a deep breath, my training in public speaking and command presence taking over. When I spoke, my voice was clear, confident, and carried easily through the ballroom. Thank you, Mr. Brennan, for your kind words and for your own service to our country. It's an honor to be here celebrating your engagement to my sister Natalie. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as possible. This was a technique I had learned early in my career, how to command a room's attention, how to establish authority without aggression. I want to share something with all of you tonight. Family is supposed to be the foundation upon which we build our lives. It's supposed to be the source of unconditional love, unwavering support, and shared pride in each other's achievements. Tonight, thanks to Lucas's generosity of spirit, I've been reminded of what that kind of family love can look like. The silence in the room was absolute now. You could have heard a pin drop. I could see my parents' horror growing with each word, their realization that their years of erasure were about to be exposed in front of everyone who mattered in Pine Ridge's social hierarchy. You see, for the past 25 years, I have served our nation with pride and dedication. I have missed countless family gatherings, holidays, and celebrations because I was deployed overseas, protecting American interests and American lives. I have sacrificed personal relationships, comfortable living arrangements, and easy career paths because I believed in something larger than myself. I gestured toward my parents, who looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. My family has always known about my service, of course. They've known about my promotions, my commendations, my achievements. They've received the official notifications, the ceremony invitations, the news clippings, when my promotion to Admiral made national headlines. The crowd was beginning to understand where this was heading. I could see the confusion on some faces giving way to concern, then to dawning realization. But what many of you may not have realized, given the beautiful slideshow and video presentation we've seen tonight, is that somehow, despite all of these achievements, despite all of this service to our country, I have been systematically excluded from my own family's narrative. The gasps were audible now. People were looking back and forth between me and my parents, trying to process what they were hearing. The slideshow you saw tonight contained hundreds of family photos spanning nearly 3 decades. Photos from birthdays, holidays, graduations, family vacations. And in every single image where I should have appeared alongside my sister, I had been carefully edited out, cropped away, erased. The murmur that ran through the crowd was angry now, shocked. These were people who valued family, who understood the importance of supporting your children's achievements. What I was describing was unthinkable to them. The video presentation spoke lovingly about their, their, only daughter. As if the woman standing before you tonight, wearing the uniform of a United States Admiral, had never existed at all. My mother made a small sound, almost a whimper. My father's face had gone from pale to gray. Natalie was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. But I wasn't finished. 25 years of silence had been broken, and the words flowed out of me like water through a broken dam. I want you to understand what this means. 3 weeks ago, I stood in the Pentagon and received my Admiral's star from the Secretary of the Navy himself. It was a historic moment. I am the youngest woman ever to achieve this rank. The ceremony was broadcast on national television. News outlets from around the world covered the story. And my phone remained silent. Not one congratulatory message from anyone in this room who shares my DNA. The crowd was getting restless now, their shock turning to anger on my behalf. I could hear people muttering, see heads shaking in disbelief. The Harper family standing in Pine Ridge society was crumbling in real time. I have commanded ships with crews of over 1,000 sailors. I have made decisions that affected national security at the highest levels. I have been briefed alongside generals and cabinet members. I have risked my life in service to the same flag that flies over this building, the same constitution that protects every person in this room. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. When I continued, my voice was softer but somehow more powerful. And yet, when I walked into this ballroom tonight, wearing the uniform I have earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, my own family treated me like a stranger. No acknowledgement of my service. No recognition of my achievements. No place of honor at their table. No mention in their speeches. As if I was invisible. The silence was deafening. 200 people sat in stunned quiet, processing the magnitude of what they had just heard. Some were crying. Others looked angry. A few appeared ashamed, perhaps realizing their own role in overlooking me throughout the evening. I looked directly at my parents, who sat frozen in their chairs like deer caught in headlights. I want everyone in this room to understand something. The woman you've just learned is a United States Admiral didn't become invisible by accident. She was made invisible by choice. By the deliberate actions of people who should have loved her unconditionally, but instead chose embarrassment over pride, shame over celebration. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Cassandra, please. But I held up my hand, and he fell silent. The authority in that simple gesture was unmistakable. This was a woman accustomed to being obeyed, to commanding respect through presence and bearing rather than volume or aggression. I'm not finished, Dad. For 25 years, I have swallowed my disappointment. I have made excuses for your behavior. I have told myself that maybe you were proud of me, but just didn't know how to show it. I have convinced myself that perhaps military service was simply something you didn't understand. I gestured to Lucas, who stood beside me with obvious admiration and respect. But tonight, a man who has known me for exactly 3 hours showed me more recognition and honor than my own family has shown me in a quarter-century of distinguished service. The applause began again, this time led by Lucas himself. It was different from the earlier applause. This was deeper, more meaningful. These people were applauding not just my achievements, but my courage in speaking truth to the people who had failed me so completely. As the applause died down, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I want to tell you all a story. A story about a little girl who dreamed of adventure, who looked at maps and imagined exploring distant places, who read about heroes and decided she wanted to be one herself. I could see some people nodding, recognizing perhaps their own children or grandchildren in my description. That little girl applied to the Naval Academy against her parents' wishes. She worked 2 jobs to pay for application fees. She studied harder than anyone else in her high school class. She ran 5 miles every morning before school to prepare for the physical requirements. And when she was accepted, one of only a handful of women in her class, her parents didn't attend her graduation. The shocked murmurs were growing louder. In Pine Ridge, family was everything. The idea of parents missing their child's graduation from one of the most prestigious institutions in America was simply incomprehensible. That little girl became a young woman who served with distinction in some of the most dangerous places on earth. She missed Christmas dinners because she was deployed. She missed birthday parties because she was at sea. She missed weddings and funerals and family gatherings because she was serving her country. And every time she came home on leave, hoping to be welcomed as the hero she had become, she found doors closed and conversations that stopped when she entered the room. I could see tears in many eyes now, and not just from the women in the crowd. Some of the men looked genuinely moved, perhaps imagining their own daughters in my position. But tonight, something beautiful happened. Tonight, a man who understands the value of service, who recognizes the sacrifice required to wear this uniform, chose to honor not just me but all those who serve. Lucas Brennan reminded everyone in this room that freedom isn't free, that the liberties we enjoy come at a price paid by people willing to stand between our families and those who would harm them. Lucas nodded, his own eyes bright with emotion. Natalie was looking at him with something that might have been new understanding, seeing perhaps a side of her fiancé she hadn't fully appreciated before. I want to thank Mr. Brennan for his recognition tonight, but more than that, I want to thank him for showing everyone here what true honor looks like, what genuine respect means, what family should be. The applause was thunderous now, sustained and heartfelt. People were standing, clapping not just for me, but for Lucas as well, recognizing the courage it had taken for him to break the family's carefully maintained fiction. As the applause finally died down, I made my closing statement. I have spent my entire adult life defending the values that make America great. Values like honor, courage, integrity, and respect for those who serve something larger than themselves. Tonight, thanks to one man's decency, I have been reminded that those values still exist, even in places where I had lost hope of finding them. I looked one more time at my parents, who sat in stunned silence, their social destruction complete. I am proud of my service. I am proud of my achievements. I am proud of the woman I have become. And I will no longer apologize for being someone my family finds inconvenient to acknowledge. I handed the microphone back to Lucas, who took it with obvious respect and admiration. As I stepped back, he leaned forward to speak once more. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Cassandra Harper, a true American hero, and an honor to know. The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. 200 people on their feet, applauding not just politely but with genuine enthusiasm and respect. Several veterans in the crowd saluted again. Women were crying openly. Men nodded with obvious approval and admiration. And through it all, the Harper family table remained an island of devastated silence in a sea of celebration. As I walked back through the crowd, people reached out to shake my hand, to thank me for my service, to express their admiration and their shock at how I had been treated. The same people who had ignored me all evening now competed for my attention, suddenly desperate to be associated with the real hero in the room. But I kept walking, my bearings straight and dignified, until I reached the exit. I had said what needed to be said. I had reclaimed my dignity and my voice. The rest was up to them. Behind me, I could hear Lucas attempting to salvage the evening, thanking everyone for coming and trying to restore some semblance of celebration to what had become a revelation of family dysfunction. But the damage was done. The Harper family's carefully constructed image lay in ruins, and everyone in Pine Ridge now knew exactly what kind of people they really were. As I stepped out into the cool Colorado night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The weight of years of silence finally lifting from my shoulders. Whatever came next, I would face it as Admiral Cassandra Harper, not as the invisible daughter who had spent 25 years waiting for recognition that would never come. The real battle, I knew, was just beginning. The drive back to my hotel took me through the winding streets of Pine Ridge, past the familiar landmarks of my childhood. The ice cream shop where Frank Davidson had taken me every summer when I turned in my reading contest forms. The park where I had practiced throwing footballs until my arm ached, determined to be better than the boys in my class. The library where I had spent countless hours reading about distant places and brave people who changed the world. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, which I supposed was natural after spending decades traveling the globe. But there was something else different about seeing it all tonight. A sense of finality, as if I was viewing these places for the last time rather than simply passing through. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I left the country club. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails piling up from numbers I didn't recognize. Word traveled fast in a town like Pine Ridge, and apparently my revelation at the engagement party had created quite a stir. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and focused on driving. The Mountain View Inn sat at the edge of town, a modest establishment that catered mainly to tourists visiting the nearby national forest. I had chosen it deliberately, knowing my parents would never think to look for me there. They probably assumed I was staying at the Hilton near the airport, the kind of place that befitted someone of my rank and means. But I had learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to be where your opponents least expected you to be. My room was simple but clean, with a view of the peaks that had dominated the horizon of my childhood. I hung my dress uniform carefully in the closet, running my hands over the fabric one last time. The gold braids seemed to catch the lamplight, reminding me of all the ceremonies and occasions where I had worn it with pride, representing not just myself, but every sailor under my command. I changed into civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater that made me look like any other middle-aged woman, and sat down at the small desk by the window. The events of the evening replayed in my mind like scenes from a movie, each moment crystal clear despite the emotional intensity. Lucas Brennan's salute had been perfect. Not just technically correct, but imbued with genuine respect and understanding. I had served alongside thousands of Marines during joint operations, and I knew the difference between someone going through the motions and someone who truly comprehended what the uniform represented. His words during the speeches had been equally impressive. He had clearly done his homework, learning about my service record and achievements in advance of the party. Which raised an interesting question. How had he known? I pulled out my laptop and did what any good intelligence officer would do. I researched my target. Lucas Brennan's background unfolded across my screen in newspaper articles, professional profiles, and social media posts that painted a picture of a man far more complex than the simple architect my family had described. He had graduated from West Point in 1995, serving as an Army officer for 8 years before transitioning to civilian life. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. A Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat. He had left the Army as a major, using his GI Bill benefits to earn a master's degree in architecture from Colorado State University. His architectural firm specialized in designing facilities for veterans, transitional housing, medical centers, community centers. He served on the board of 3 different veterans organizations and had personally funded scholarships for military children. The local newspaper had done a feature story on him just 6 months ago, highlighting his pro bono work designing a new facility for homeless veterans in Denver. This was not a man who had stumbled into recognizing my service by accident. This was someone who understood military culture from the inside, who had lived the same experiences of deployment and sacrifice that had shaped my own life. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, processing this new information. Lucas Brennan wasn't just my sister's fiancé. He was a kindred spirit, someone who had walked a similar path and emerged with his integrity intact. No wonder he had been appalled by my family's treatment of me. But that raised another question that made my chest tighten with a mixture of hope and dread. If Lucas had researched my background enough to know about my service record and recent promotion, what else had he discovered? And more importantly, what had he shared with Natalie? My phone buzzed again, and this time I glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls from my sister, along with a text message that simply read, "We need to talk, please." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. 25 years of disappointment warred with a small, stubborn part of my heart that still remembered the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Instead of replying to Natalie, I found myself scrolling through the other messages that had accumulated. Several were from local reporters, somehow having gotten my number and wanting comments about the evening's events. A few were from people I vaguely remembered from high school, suddenly eager to reconnect with their famous classmate. But one message caught my attention because it was from a number I didn't recognize, with a simple but intriguing text. Admiral Harper, this is Lucas Brennan. I apologize for the circus tonight, but not for honoring you. We should talk. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Silver Creek Diner? I'll be there regardless. I found myself smiling for the first time since leaving the party. Silver Creek Diner was a local institution, the kind of place where old-timers gathered every morning to solve the world's problems over coffee and eggs. It was also neutral territory, public enough to prevent any dramatic confrontations, but private enough for honest conversation. I texted back a simple, "I'll be there," and set my phone aside. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces in that ballroom. The shock and horror on my parents' expressions, as their carefully constructed facade crumbled in real time. The embarrassment and confusion on Natalie's face as she realized her fairy tale engagement party had become something else entirely. The genuine respect and admiration in Lucas's eyes as he saluted me with perfect military precision. But it wasn't just the evening's events that kept me awake. Memories I had spent years suppressing began surfacing like debris after a storm, each one bringing its own particular brand of pain. I remembered my first Christmas leave from the Naval Academy, how excited I had been to come home and share stories of my training, my new friends, the incredible education I was receiving. I had brought gifts for everyone, carefully chosen items from the Academy gift shop that I thought would make my family proud to display. Instead, I had found the house decorated as if I didn't exist. No stocking hung for me on the mantel. No gifts waited under the tree with my name on them. When I had asked about it, my mother had shrugged and said they hadn't been sure I was coming home. I had been confirmed to arrive 3 weeks earlier. That same Christmas, I had tried to share stories about my classes, about learning navigation and engineering and leadership principles. My father had listened with thinly veiled impatience before changing the subject to Natalie's high school cheerleading competition. My mother had been more direct, telling me that no one wanted to hear about all that military nonsense during the holidays. I remembered my first deployment, sending letters home that went unanswered for months. I had written about the places I was seeing, the people I was meeting, the responsibility I felt as a young officer. When I finally called from a port in the Mediterranean, my mother's first words had been about how Natalie had been accepted to the state university, and wasn't that wonderful news? The pattern had been consistent over the years. My achievements were met with silence or dismissal. My homecomings were treated as inconveniences. My attempts to stay connected were rebuffed with varying degrees of politeness, but always with the same underlying message. You chose to leave, so don't expect us to celebrate your choices. The irony was that I had never stopped loving them, even as their rejection cut deeper and deeper. Even as I built a life and career that had nothing to do with their approval, I had continued to hope that someday they would see me differently, that someday my service would matter to them. Watching those edited photos and videos tonight, seeing myself literally erased from our family history, had finally killed that hope, not with anger or rage, but with a kind of tired acceptance. They had made their choice long ago. Tonight had simply made it public. I must have dozed eventually, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the hotel room curtains, and the sound of my phone alarm at 7:30. I showered, dressed in the same jeans and sweater from the night before, and drove to Silver Creek Diner through streets that were quieter than usual for a Saturday morning. The diner sat on the outskirts of town, a classic 1950s establishment, with red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures that had been lovingly maintained over the decades. I had eaten there countless times as a child, usually with Frank Davidson after some adventure or accomplishment he wanted to celebrate. Frank had been my grandfather's best friend, but he had become something more to me, a surrogate grandfather who saw potential where others saw problems. He had been the one to encourage my interest in maps and navigation. He had been the one to teach me to drive a stick shift in his old pickup truck. He had been the one to sit patiently while I practiced, tying different kinds of knots, preparing for the sailing lessons I dreamed of taking someday. Most importantly, he had been the one to listen when I talked about wanting to serve in the military. While my parents dismissed my interests as a phase, Frank had taken them seriously. He had shared stories from his own Navy service during Vietnam, not the sanitized versions you might tell children, but honest accounts of what it meant to serve, to lead, to make decisions that affected other people's lives. When I was 16 and starting to research military academies, Frank had driven me to Denver to meet with recruiters. He had helped me understand the application process, the physical requirements, the academic standards. He had even helped me practice for interviews, sitting across from me at his kitchen table and asking the kinds of probing questions I would need to answer. My parents had been furious when they found out. Not just about Frank's involvement, but about the entire idea of their daughter pursuing a military career. The argument had been epic, with accusations flying about inappropriate influence and manipulation. Frank had endured it all with quiet dignity, never defending himself, never pointing out that he was simply supporting a young woman's dreams when her own parents wouldn't. He had died during my second year at the academy, a sudden heart attack that took him before I could get home on emergency leave. I had worn my dress uniform to his funeral, standing at attention beside his casket, while my family treated me like a stranger in costume. But Frank had left something behind. Not just memories, but a concrete legacy that I was only beginning to understand. After his death, I had learned that he had been quietly supporting my academy expenses, sending anonymous checks to cover costs my family refused to help with. His lawyer had contacted me with news of a modest trust fund, enough to ensure I could complete my education without financial stress. The note that came with the inheritance had been brief but profound. Cass, your dreams matter. Your service matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Make this old sailor proud. Now, sitting in the parking lot of Silver Creek Diner 25 years later, I wondered what Frank would have thought about the previous evening's events. Probably something wise about truth being like sunlight, sometimes painful, but necessary for growth. Lucas Brennan was already there when I walked in, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee and a newspaper folded beside him. He looked different in civilian clothes, more relaxed but no less impressive. He stood when he saw me, a gesture of respect that reminded me once again that this man understood military courtesy. "Admiral Harper," he said as I approached. "Thank you for coming." "Cass," I replied, sliding into the booth across from him. "I think after last night's performance we can dispense with the formalities." He smiled, and I could see why Natalie had fallen for him. It wasn't just his looks, though he was undeniably handsome. It was the intelligence in his eyes, the sense of depth and character that came from someone who had faced real challenges and emerged stronger. "I owe you an explanation," he said without preamble. "What I did last night wasn't planned. I mean, I knew about your service record, of course, but calling you forward like that wasn't something I had discussed with anyone." I sipped my coffee, studying his face. "How did you know?" "About my promotion, my service record, all of it." His expression grew serious. "Research. When Natalie and I got engaged, I wanted to learn everything I could about her family. It's important to me to understand the people I'm joining my life with." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I found didn't match what I was being told. Official records, news articles, military databases. They all painted a picture of someone remarkable, someone who should have been the crown jewel of any family. But when I asked Natalie about her sister, the responses were vague, dismissive. When I asked your parents, they changed the subject. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, and that didn't strike you as odd?" "It struck me as heartbreaking," he said simply. "I've served alongside enough military families to recognize the patterns. The sacrifices, the missed holidays, the long deployments. I know what it costs to serve, and I know what it costs the families who support that service. What I was seeing in your family wasn't support. It was erasure." The waitress approached our table, and we ordered breakfast with the kind of automatic politeness that comes from years of public service. When she left, Lucas continued. "I started paying attention to things I might have missed before. The family photos in their home, carefully cropped or selected to avoid showing a second daughter. The stories they told about family history. Always about Natalie's achievements, never about yours. The way conversations stopped when I brought up military service or current events that might relate to your expertise. I set down my coffee cup, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. So you decided to expose them publicly? I decided to honor you publicly, he corrected. There's a difference. I knew that if I simply mentioned your achievements quietly, they would find a way to minimize or dismiss them. But if I created a moment that demanded recognition, that put your service in a context everyone could understand, they couldn't ignore it without looking like unpatriotic monsters, I finished. Exactly. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Cass, I've read your service record. I know about your command in the Gulf, your logistics work during the Iraq withdrawal, your role in the anti-piracy operations off Somalia. You're not just a decorated officer, you're a genuine hero. The fact that your own family doesn't see that isn't a reflection on you, it's a reflection on them. The food arrived, giving me a moment to process his words. I had spent so many years internalizing my family's rejection that hearing someone else validate my achievements felt surreal. Can I ask you something? I said finally. Anything. Does Natalie know about what you discovered? About what you were planning? His expression darkened slightly. That's complicated. I tried to talk to her about it several times over the past few months. About how proud she should be of her sister. About how extraordinary your achievements are. She always deflected, changed the subject, or gave me some variation of, Cassandra chose her career over family. He pushed eggs around on his plate, clearly struggling with what to say next. I love your sister, Cass. I'm going to marry her. But I can't pretend to respect the way your family has treated you. Last night, when I saw you standing alone against that wall, wearing a uniform that represents everything I believe in, while your own parents pretended you didn't exist. You couldn't let it stand, I said. I couldn't let it stand, he confirmed. And I won't apologize for that choice, even if it creates problems in my relationship with Natalie. We ate in silence for a few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Lucas looked up from his plate. There's something else you should know. About Frank Davidson. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. What about Frank? He left something behind. Something your family doesn't know about. Something he wanted you to have when you were ready for it. The diner suddenly felt too small. Too warm. What are you talking about? Lucas reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with old-fashioned wax. My name was written across the front in Frank's familiar handwriting. He gave this to my father years ago, with specific instructions. It was to be held until you achieved the rank of Admiral, then delivered by someone who understood what your service meant. My hands shook as I took the envelope. The wax seal bore Frank's initials, pressed into red wax that had darkened with time. Your father knew Frank? I managed to ask. They served together in Vietnam. Same unit, different specialties. When Frank was dying, he reached out to his old military contacts looking for someone he could trust with this. Someone who would understand the importance of getting it to you at the right time. I stared at the envelope, afraid to open it, afraid of what memories it might contain. How long have you had this? My father gave it to me when I learned I was dating a Harper. He'd been holding on to it for 15 years, waiting for the right person to deliver it. The weight of the envelope in my hands felt enormous, as if it contained not just paper but possibilities. Whatever Frank had written, whatever he had wanted me to know, it had been important enough for him to create an elaborate plan for its delivery. I need to read this alone, I said quietly. Lucas nodded understanding. Of course. But Cass, before you do, I want you to know something. Whatever happens with Natalie, whatever complications this creates in my family relationships, I'm glad I honored you last night. You deserved that recognition. You deserved so much more than that. He stood up, dropping money on the table to cover both our meals. Frank Davidson was right to believe in you, and he wasn't the only one. As he walked away, I sat alone in the diner booth, holding an envelope that might contain the answers I had been seeking my entire adult life. Outside the window, Pine Ridge continued its Saturday morning routine, unaware that the previous evening's revelations were just the beginning of a much larger story. With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal and unfolded Frank Davidson's final message to me. The letter unfolded like a map to buried treasure, Frank Davidson's careful handwriting still clear despite the years. His words reached across time, carrying the voice of the man who had been more of a father to me than my own blood ever was. "My dear Cass," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've achieved something I always knew you would, but that the world told you was impossible. Admiral. The word carries weight, doesn't it? Not just the rank, but everything it represents. The barriers broken, the glass ceiling shattered, the young women who will follow in your wake because you showed them the path." I had to stop reading for a moment, my eyes blurring with tears I hadn't shed in years. The familiar warmth of Frank's voice seemed to fill the empty diner booth, as if he were sitting across from me sharing one of our old conversations over coffee and pie. "I'm writing this letter knowing I won't be around to see your greatest triumphs, but also knowing with absolute certainty that they're coming. You have something your family never understood, something they were too small to recognize. Not just courage, but moral clarity. The ability to see what's right and pursue it regardless of personal cost." The next paragraph made my breath catch in my throat. "By now, you've probably wondered why your family turned against you so completely. Why parents who should have celebrated your achievements instead chose to erase them. The answer isn't pretty, Cass, but you deserve to know the truth. It's not about your career choice or your success. It's about money." My hands began to shake as I read the next lines. "Your grandfather, William Harper, left a considerable inheritance when he died, not just to his son Richard, but to his granddaughters. Equal shares, to be distributed when each granddaughter reached age 35, or achieved significant military rank, whichever came first. The inheritance included not just money but property, investments, and a trust fund that has been growing for 20 years. The coffee in my cup had grown cold, but I couldn't move to signal the waitress. I was frozen in place, absorbing words that reframed everything I thought I knew about my family's rejection. "Richard and Diane have been managing that inheritance since your grandfather's death, using the funds for their own lifestyle, while hoping against hope that you would never achieve the rank that would trigger your inheritance claim. Every promotion you earned brought them closer to financial ruin. Every achievement you celebrated was a threat to the comfortable life they've built on money that was rightfully yours." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. My parents' sudden upgrade in lifestyle after my grandfather's death. The new house. The luxury cars. The country club memberships. My mother's designer clothes and expensive jewelry. My father's early retirement from his modest job at the insurance company. They had been living on my inheritance for 20 years. The erasure from family photos, the dismissal of your achievements, the systematic campaign to make you feel unwanted. It was all designed to keep you away. They hoped that if they made home unwelcome enough, you would stay away permanently and never discover what was rightfully yours. Frank's handwriting became more urgent in the next paragraph, as if he could feel his time running out. "I tried to tell you indirectly over the years, dropping hints about your grandfather's pride in you, about provisions he had made for your future. But you were so young when he died, and so hurt by your family's treatment, that you never picked up on what I was trying to say. I should have been more direct, should have told you outright. That's a regret I'll carry to my grave." The letter continued with practical information: the name of the law firm that had handled my grandfather's estate, account numbers for investments that should have been transferred to my name years ago, copies of documents that proved not only my right to the inheritance, but my parents' illegal appropriation of it. I've documented everything I could find, made copies of all the relevant papers. The evidence is stored in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, Box 847. The key is taped under the drawer of my old desk, the one you used to sit at when you were doing homework at my house. The bank manager, Helen Torres, is Captain Torres's aunt. She knows the situation and will help you when you're ready. Captain Torres, my former commanding officer, now stationed at the Pentagon. Frank had been building a network of support for me even as my own family was tearing me down. Cass, I want you to understand something important. This isn't about the money, though you deserve every penny of what your grandfather intended for you. This is about justice. This is about people being held accountable for their choices. Your parents made a calculated decision to steal from you, to lie to you, to systematically destroy your relationship with your family for their own financial benefit. The final paragraphs of the letter brought fresh tears to my eyes. You are the granddaughter William Harper was most proud of, even though he died when you were so young. He used to tell me about your questions, your curiosity, your determination to understand how things worked. He said you had the mind of an explorer and the heart of a warrior. He knew you would do something extraordinary with your life. He also knew your parents. He saw their weaknesses, their tendency to choose easy comfort over hard responsibility. That's why he structured the inheritance the way he did, not to punish them, but to ensure that his granddaughters would have the resources to pursue their dreams without financial constraint. Your dream was always service, always something bigger than yourself. Natalie's dreams have always been smaller, more traditional. Marriage, family, social status. Nothing wrong with that, but your grandfather recognized the difference. He wanted to make sure you had the means to continue serving without sacrifice. The letter ended with words that would haunt me for days to come. I'm proud of you, Cass. Proud of the officer you've become. Proud of the woman you've grown into. Proud of the leader you are. Your grandfather would be proud too. Your family's blindness to your worth is their tragedy, not yours. Never forget that you are worthy of love, worthy of respect, worthy of celebration. And know that somewhere, an old sailor is watching over you with enormous pride. Take what's yours, honey. You've earned it 1,000 times over. The signature was shaky but unmistakably Frank's, followed by a postscript that made me smile despite the overwhelming emotions. P.S. Don't let them make you feel guilty about claiming what's yours. They had 20 years to do the right thing. They chose differently. Sometimes consequences are the only teacher people understand. I sat in that diner booth for another hour, rereading the letter and processing the magnitude of what Frank had revealed. My family's rejection hadn't been about disappointment or misunderstanding. It had been a deliberate campaign to steal my inheritance and keep me from discovering their betrayal. Every missed phone call, every unanswered letter, every cold reception when I came home on leave, it had all been calculated to keep me at a distance. They hadn't been ashamed of my military service. They had been terrified of my success. When I finally stood up to leave, my legs felt unsteady beneath me. The drive to Frank's old house was automatic, muscle memory guiding me through streets I had walked as a child. The house had been sold after his death to a young family, but I knew they wouldn't mind if I explained the situation. The current owners, a couple in their 30s with 2 small children, were surprisingly understanding when I showed up at their door with Frank's letter and an explanation of what I needed. They had kept Frank's old desk in the basement, using it as a workbench, but never moving it from its original position. The key was exactly where Frank had said it would be, taped under the bottom drawer with yellowing adhesive that spoke to how long it had been waiting for me. The metal was warm in my palm, a tangible connection to the man who had believed in me when no one else would. First National Bank was a short drive across town, past the elementary school where I had first learned to read maps in Mrs. Peterson's geography class, past the park where Frank had taught me to identify constellations, past the church where my family had worshipped while treating me like a stranger. Helen Torres turned out to be a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and her nephew's same bearing of quiet competence. She had been expecting me, she said, for 15 years. Frank made me promise to help you when you came, she explained, as she led me to the safety deposit box vault. He was very specific about the conditions, military rank of Admiral or age 35, whichever came first. He also made me promise to document everything, to ensure you had legal proof of what had been hidden from you. The safety deposit box contained a treasure trove of documents that painted a devastating picture of my family's deception. Bank statements showing regular transfers from my inheritance account to my parents' personal accounts. Investment records showing substantial growth in funds that should have been transferred to my name. Legal documents proving that I should have gained access to my inheritance when I made captain at age 32, 3 years ago. But the most damning evidence was a series of letters between my parents and their attorney, discussing strategies for keeping me unaware of the inheritance while continuing to access the funds. The correspondence made their motivations crystal clear. This wasn't about family dynamics or personal disappointment. This was fraud, pure and simple. Helen helped me make copies of everything, her expression growing more troubled as she reviewed each document. "Your parents could face serious legal consequences for this," she said quietly. "This isn't just family drama. This is theft. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraud. We're talking about federal crimes." I nodded, but my mind was already moving beyond legal consequences to the broader implications. The inheritance Frank had documented was substantial. Enough to change my life, enough to explain my parents' desperate campaign to keep me away. More importantly, it provided the missing piece of the puzzle that had tormented me for decades. My family's rejection hadn't been about my choices or my personality or my failure to meet their expectations. It had been about protecting a lie they had been living for 20 years. The drive back to my hotel gave me time to process what I had learned and plan my next moves. Frank's letter had provided not just answers but evidence, not just explanations but actionable intelligence. I was no longer the confused daughter wondering why her family couldn't love her. I was a naval officer with documentation of systematic fraud and theft. But I was also something else. A woman who had been grieving the loss of her family for 25 years, only to discover that they had never been lost. They had been sold. Back in my hotel room, I spread the documents across the desk and began making phone calls. First to Captain Torres at the Pentagon, who listened with growing anger as I explained the situation. Then to a military attorney she recommended, someone who specialized in cases involving fraud against service members. Then to a civilian attorney in Denver, who had experience with estate disputes and family law. The picture they painted was clear. I had an airtight case for recovering my inheritance, with interest and penalties that would likely bankrupt my parents. More than that, the evidence of their deliberate deception opened them up to criminal charges that could result in prison time. As the sun set over the mountains outside my window, I found myself thinking not about legal strategies or financial calculations, but about the little girl who had once sat in Frank Davidson's kitchen, listening to stories about courage and honor and doing what was right even when it was hard. That little girl had grown up to be a woman who commanded ships and led thousands of sailors. She had faced enemy fire and natural disasters and political crises with calm competence. She had earned the respect of presidents and generals and foreign leaders. But she had never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, her own family would see her worth. Now, surrounded by evidence of their calculated betrayal, she finally understood that some hopes are not meant to be fulfilled. Some dreams are not meant to come true. Some people are not capable of the love you need them to give. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is stop waiting for them to change and start demanding the justice you deserve. My phone buzzed with a text message from Natalie. "Cass, please, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but there are things you don't understand." I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about all the things I hadn't understood just 24 hours ago. Then I typed back a simple response. "You're right. There are things I didn't understand. But I do now." Her reply came immediately. "What do you mean?" I attached a photo of Frank's letter and the bank documents, then typed, "I mean, I know about grandfather's inheritance. I know about the money you've been living on for 20 years. I know about all of it." The silence that followed was deafening. No immediate response, no explanation, no denial. Just the digital equivalent of a long, guilty pause. When she finally replied, her message was shorter than I expected. "Can we meet tomorrow? Just us?" I looked out the window at the lights of Pine Ridge twinkling in the darkness, at the town where I had been born but had never truly belonged. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and harder decisions. Tomorrow would determine whether any part of my relationship with my family could be salvaged. But tonight, I had something I had never possessed before: the truth. And truth, Frank had always told me, was the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. I texted Natalie back. 10 a.m. Silver Creek Diner. Come alone. Then I turned off my phone and began preparing for the most important battle of my life. Not against foreign enemies or natural disasters, but against the people who had raised me and betrayed me in equal measure. Outside my window, Pine Ridge settled into another quiet evening, unaware that its most decorated daughter was about to demand an accounting that would shake the foundations of one of its most prominent families. Frank Davidson had always said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was feeling the fear and moving forward anyway. As I fell asleep that night, his words echoing in my mind, I knew that tomorrow would test that definition in ways I had never imagined. Natalie arrived at Silver Creek Diner 15 minutes early, but I had been there for 30. Old habits from decades of military service: arrive early, assess the terrain, maintain tactical advantage. She looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by dark circles under her eyes and clothes that suggested she had slept poorly, if at all. She slid into the booth across from me with none of her usual grace, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the coffee cup the waitress had already placed on the table. For several minutes we sat in silence, two sisters who had become strangers measuring each other across a divide that seemed impossibly wide. I've been awake all night, she finally said, her voice hoarse. Thinking about what you sent me, trying to figure out how to explain 20 years of lies. I studied her face, looking for signs of the sister I had once known beneath the woman she had become. Try starting with the truth. It's simpler than you think. Natalie's laugh was bitter, hollow. The truth. The truth is that we're broke, Cass. Have been for years. The truth is that everything you saw at the engagement party, everything you think we have, it's all built on money that wasn't ours to spend. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, as if trying to draw warmth from it. When grandfather died, Dad was supposed to manage the inheritance until we both reached 35 or achieved military rank. The money was supposed to be invested, protected, kept safe for our futures. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Instead, they used it to maintain a lifestyle they could never afford. The house, the cars, the country club memberships, Mom's shopping, Dad's early retirement, all of it came from inheritance money that should have been growing in trust accounts. I remained silent, letting her continue. This was her confession, and I had learned long ago that interrupting someone's unburdening rarely led to complete truth. When you made captain 3 years ago, we all knew what that meant. You had achieved the rank that would trigger your inheritance claim. But by then, there wasn't enough money left to pay what we owed you. They had spent not just your share but mine too, believing they could somehow replace it before either of us found out. Natalie's composure cracked, tears sliding down her cheeks. So they doubled down on keeping you away. Every achievement you celebrated was a threat to their secret. Every promotion brought you closer to discovering what they had done. They convinced themselves that if they could just keep you distant enough, angry enough, hurt enough, you would never come back to claim what was yours. The calculation behind their cruelty was breathtaking in its coldness. And you went along with it. She flinched as if I had slapped her. I was 18 when grandfather died, Cass. 18, and in college, and completely dependent on them financially. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already complicit. They were paying for my education, my apartment, my car, my entire life, with money that belonged to both of us. Her tears came harder now, but I felt no urge to comfort her. 25 years of rejection and erasure had burned that instinct out of me. I told myself it would be okay, she continued. That they would figure out how to pay it back before it mattered. That maybe you would never want to come home anyway, so what difference did it make? I convinced myself that we were protecting you from disappointment, that you were happier building your own life away from us. You convinced yourself that stealing my inheritance was somehow merciful, I said flatly. Yes, she whispered. And I know how insane that sounds now. I know how selfish and cruel it was. But Cass, you have to understand. I was trapped. If I told you the truth, it would destroy our parents. If I stayed silent, it would destroy you. I chose them. The admission hung between us like smoke from a crash site. At least she was being honest now, even if that honesty came 25 years too late. Lucas knows, she said suddenly. Not everything, but enough. He figured out that something was wrong with how we talked about you, how we avoided discussing your achievements. He started asking questions I couldn't answer without lying. She looked up at me with desperate eyes. He's a good man, Cass. Better than I deserve. And he was right to honor you the way he did. You deserved that recognition. You deserved so much more than what we gave you. I leaned back in the booth, processing her words. What do you want from me, Natalie? Forgiveness? Understanding? Permission to keep pretending this was all just a misunderstanding? I want to make it right, she said quickly. Whatever's left of the money, whatever we can recover or replace, I want you to have it. I want to sell the house, liquidate everything, pay you back with interest. I know it won't undo the damage, but it's a start. Her offer was meaningless, and we both knew it. The house was mortgaged beyond its value, their assets leveraged against debts they could never repay. Even if they sold everything they owned, it wouldn't come close to covering what they had stolen, much less the growth that money should have generated over 20 years. It's too late for that, I said gently. The amount they've taken, with 20 years of lost investment growth, is more than your entire family's net worth. They've been living beyond their means for so long that bankruptcy is inevitable once the truth comes out. Natalie's face went white. What are you saying? I'm saying that your parents are going to prison, Natalie. What they did isn't just stealing. It's fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy. The federal government takes a very dim view of people who steal from military families. She began shaking her head frantically. There has to be another way, some kind of payment plan, some arrangement. There is, I interrupted. I could choose not to press charges. I could accept whatever they can scrape together and walk away. I could let them keep their freedom and their reputation while I absorbed the loss of everything grandfather intended for me. Hope flickered in her eyes, quickly followed by shame as she realized what she was hoping for. But I'm not going to do that, I continued. Because what they did to me wasn't just theft. It was psychological warfare designed to destroy my relationship with my family. They made me believe I was unwanted, unloved, a disappointment. They made me question my own worth for decades while they profited from my inheritance. I pulled out my phone and showed her the contacts I had been adding all morning. I've already spoken with 3 attorneys, Natalie. Criminal prosecutors who specialize in financial fraud. They're very interested in this case, especially the systematic campaign to keep me away from family events where I might learn the truth. Natalie buried her face in her hands. Please, Cass. I know we don't deserve your mercy, but I'm begging you. Think about what this will do to the family, to the community. Think about Lucas and our future children who will have to live with this scandal. I am thinking about Lucas, I replied. He's the only person in this entire situation who acted with honor and integrity. He saw an injustice and chose to address it, even knowing it might complicate his own life. He's exactly the kind of man who deserves to know the truth about the family he's joining. I stood up, leaving money on the table for both our coffees. You made your choice 25 years ago, Natalie. You chose them over me. Comfort over truth, complicity over courage. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. She looked up at me with desperate eyes. What can I do? How can I fix this? You can't, I said simply. Some things can't be fixed. Only survived. The question is whether you'll survive it with integrity or just more lies. I walked out of Silver Creek Diner for what I knew would be the last time, leaving my sister crying quietly in the booth, where Frank Davidson had once celebrated my small victories with chocolate cake and endless encouragement. The next several hours passed in a blur of legal consultations and formal statements. The attorneys I had contacted were indeed very interested in the case, particularly the evidence Frank had compiled documenting the systematic fraud. By noon, the process was in motion. Criminal complaints filed, civil suits initiated, asset freezes requested. The local news picked up the story by evening, though they initially treated it as a simple inheritance dispute rather than the criminal fraud it actually was. That changed when one enterprising reporter discovered my military record and realized that a decorated admiral was accusing her own family of stealing her inheritance while she served overseas. By the following morning, the story had gone national. Cable news shows featured legal experts discussing the case, veterans organizations issued statements of support, and social media exploded with commentary about families who failed to support their military members. The Harper family's social standing in Pine Ridge evaporated overnight. Country club memberships were quietly terminated. Business relationships dissolved. Long-standing friendships turned cold. In a community that prided itself on supporting the troops, being exposed as people who had stolen from their own military daughter was social suicide. My parents' arrest came on a Tuesday morning, captured by news cameras as they were led from their home in handcuffs. My father looked like he had aged a decade in the 5 days since the engagement party. My mother's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, leaving her looking small and frightened and very much older than her years. I watched the coverage from my temporary apartment in Denver, feeling nothing but a vast emptiness where anger should have been. There was no satisfaction in their humiliation, no joy in their downfall, only the hollow ache of a family destroyed by greed and lies. Lucas called me that afternoon, his voice heavy with exhaustion and grief. I wanted you to know that Natalie and I have called off the engagement. Not because of the scandal, but because I can't marry someone who was willing to participate in something like this. I wasn't surprised, but I was sorry for him. I'm sorry, Lucas. I know you loved her. I loved who I thought she was, he corrected. The woman I was engaged to doesn't exist. She was a character created to hide 25 years of complicity and fraud and family betrayal. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want you to know that honoring you at the engagement party was the right thing to do, regardless of how it turned out. You deserved that recognition, and so much more. Thank you, I said, meaning it. And Lucas, you're going to be okay. You have integrity, and that's something no one can take away from you. The legal proceedings stretched on for months, but the outcome was never in doubt. My parents pled guilty to multiple felony charges rather than face a trial that would have exposed even more damaging details. They were sentenced to federal prison, their remaining assets liquidated to provide partial restitution. Natalie cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony that helped ensure the full scope of the fraud was documented. Her cooperation earned her a reduced sentence, but she still faced 2 years in minimum security prison for her role in the conspiracy. The inheritance I recovered, even after legal fees and decades of missed growth, was substantial enough to change my life completely. I used part of it to establish a foundation providing scholarships and support services for military families, particularly children of service members, who faced rejection or isolation because of their parents' careers. I named it the Frank Davidson Foundation, ensuring that his memory would be associated with supporting military families, rather than the tragedy that had brought his letter to light. I never returned to Pine Ridge. There was nothing left for me there but painful memories and empty relationships. Instead, I bought a small ranch in Montana, where I could see mountains in the distance but didn't have to carry the weight of childhood disappointments every time I looked at them. The Navy offered me a new assignment, promotion to Vice Admiral, command of a major installation. I turned them down. 30 years of service was enough. I had proven everything I needed to prove, to myself and to the world. I retired with full honors, my service record unblemished by the family scandal that had briefly dominated headlines. The Navy understood that I was not responsible for my family's choices, that my integrity remained intact despite their failures. Sometimes, on clear evenings when the Montana sky stretched endlessly overhead, I thought about Frank Davidson and the letters he used to write me during my early deployments. Simple notes that reminded me I was valued, that my service mattered, that someone back home was proud of what I was accomplishing. He had been the family I needed, even when I didn't understand that blood relations could never be a substitute for chosen connections, built on respect and mutual support. I thought about Lucas too, and hoped he had found someone worthy of his integrity and courage. He had shown me that recognition and honor could come from unexpected sources, that sometimes strangers understood your worth better than the people who raised you. Most of all, I thought about the little girl who had dreamed of adventure and service, who had wanted to make a difference in the world. She had grown up to become exactly who she was meant to be, despite every effort to diminish her dreams. That, in the end, was victory enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.